That's that familiar old Shaker hymn. And I think what song best is, to me, the hallmark of Dave Dellinger. And we think of Dave Dellinger, one of the celebrated of the Conspiracy 8 during that trial in Chicago as a result of the 1968 happenings in the city during the convention. Dave Dellinger was the oldest of the defendants accused of, well, we'll come to that conspiracy, one form or another. And he's laughing there now. And he's also perhaps the most, to me, if you don't mind my saying, the most principled, obstinately so. And his autobiography, a long time coming, is called From Yale to Jail, which sets it up right there. Yale, and he came out of a privileged background. And before we do that and talk about your father, early influences, and how you got to be the way you are, and you could have led a wholly different life, that song I thought is most, because it's simple.
Oh, I loved it, and I loved hearing my old friend Judy Collins sing it. She and I went through a lot together.
So we have to come to the biography, your life, and the beginning. Wakefield, Massachusetts, well-off, father, successful lawyer, very conservative guy.
Chairman of the Republican and later town Republican Committee and later the county Republican Committee.
Well, the obvious question is how you got this way, how you became a troublemaker. When you could have led, you were the top athlete of the half century of Wakefield.
I think that was an exaggeration, but that's what the paper called me in 1950. But you see, it was a very wonderful thing about my father, and it taught me a lot about what I'll call a basic nonviolent attitude, or an attitude that I believe in. We differed politically when I got older, and pretty seriously. But when I was growing up, and maybe 2 or 3 families would go out to some fancy restaurant and have dinner, with the kids, everything. It was just a nice, informal occasion, if it could be informal in that kind of restaurant. And so if the waitress made a mistake, and people would jump on her, after all, waitresses to that environment were inferior people. And my father would say, "Oh, he wanted his steak rare. I took it by mistake. He's got what I want, the well-done one." When everybody knew that wasn't the case.
He took the blame for a mistake the waitress may have made.
Exactly. And then in one incident that makes it more dramatic, one time a waitress spilled tomato sauce all down my mother's brand-new dress, which she'd been showing off to everybody and feeling so proud of and everything. And people were yelling at her. My father said, "It was my fault. I bumped her arm." And I think everybody knew he hadn't, but still, it took the heat off the waitress.
See, to me, in reading your memoir here, your autobiography, this is the beginning. To me, it almost sets the theme as to you, your father, your attitudes toward people who may disagree with you.
Exactly.
You have never, we'll come to the matter of violence and incidents in your life when you got clobbered by a guy, and you clobbered a kid and apologized. But before that, your father, a conservative, right?
Yes, politically.
Exactly the opposite.
You know who he reminds me of? They say Dom Helder Camera used to say, "When I took bread to the poor, they called me a saint. But when I asked why they were poor, they called me a communist." Well, a lot of people called my father a saint because on an individual level, he was full of compassion and love. But he never asked why the political system made people poor and why they created class and racial antagonism.
So we come to the big question. You were asking why.
Yes.
Why are there so many poor and homeless? Why do so few have so much? Why do you find the bums on the road so good? You join them along the line. Why? And you're asking why. So you and your father had some political...
Yes.
In fact, he threatened suicide at one time if you were going to resist the draft of World War II.
I was in Divinity School. And
you went to Union Theological
Union Seminary, right. And so I was exempt. All I had to do was register. But I felt that was kind of a bribe. Some people are especially religious or religious in a special way, and therefore they don't want to kill people. But meanwhile, the regular people of society will do the necessary real work. So I didn't want to be bribed that way.
Let's expand this a bit in a bit of your background. You had gone, you affluent family, and you went to Yale.
Yes.
Which was part of a family tradition, too, wasn't it?
Well, he graduated from, my father graduated from Yale Law School.
Then you went to Union Theological Seminary.
Right. I went to Oxford in between. I had a fellowship to study there.
So somewhere along the line, you had the right, since you were a ministry, seemingly ministry student, to be a CO.
Right.
Because of religious reasons.
No, you didn't even have to be a CO. You were automatically exempt.
Automatically.
There was another thing. If you were a Quaker or a Mennonite or a Brethren, one of the peace churches, or you could prove that you had special religious training, then you were a conscientious objector. But didn't matter what you thought or anything else. If you were a divinity student or a clergy person, you were exempt.
But you didn't choose that exemption. Explain what it is you did and why, and as a result of what you went to jail for it.
Well, actually, originally there were 20 of us at the seminary who decided that we did not want to accept what I called a bribe, where we would be exempt, but other people. And I'd been living in Harlem, actually, because from the seminary, you could look down first on a poor white, the seminary was high on a hill, look down on one of the poorest white sections in the city, which is no longer there, and then Harlem. And we felt that, from our understanding of the Hebrew prophets and the Christian religion, it wasn't right to be living in that kind of a situation. And people would drive up in their limousines to attend the trustees' meetings and so forth. So 5 of us moved into Harlem. And when we said we were going to, the president of the seminary said we would be expelled if we did. But we talked it through, and we decided anyway. And I think it helped that I think 3 of us were president of our class, or one was president of the student body. I was president of the beginning class. And I guess he decided it would be a scandal if he evicted us. So I knew there that contrary to the idea that everybody supported the war in this country, black people, World War II. Yeah. I think some friend of mine by the name of Studs Terkel wrote a book called The Good War. Yes. Everybody thought it was the good war, but that wasn't true at the time. And the black people in particular, they knew that the government didn't care about them, and I knew from having been in anti-Nazi Germany where I'd stayed with Jewish families that the government didn't care about the Jews either. In fact, it was turning away whole boatloads of Jewish refugees. The best-known one being the St. Louis, which went back to Germany. Some of the others went down to South America, but went back to Germany, and the Jews ended up in concentration camp and victims of the Holocaust. So anyway, I couldn't accept that I would just be silenced by being exempt. So I spoke out against. Actually, I did a year and a day along with 7 other Union seminaries before Pearl Harbor was attacked. We were in and out of jail before the U.S. was actually
at war. So you were
war.
going all the way in this, man, not looking for a way to get out. Right. Now, I got to go back to the beginning again. You could have had a nice, easy life. You think about medicine or law, or for that matter, the clergy. You have a respectable congregation somewhere. You had all the credentials. You had the background. What was it that impelled you way back?
Well, it wasn't any single thing, Studs. But when I was in junior high school, that was the first year when all the children from the town went to the same school. And I lived up in the well-to-do section called the Park, across the railroad tracks. In fact, just even my side of them, but a mile from our house, were poorer people. Well, so I made the, quote, mistake of falling in love with a poor Irish girl. Shanty Irish, they called them. I made the mistake of, I met him through athletics, but my best boyfriend and I were good athletes. And he was a poor Italian boy. And he lived right on the track, so that when I stayed overnight at his place, which my parents didn't want me to do at first, but eventually I forced it through, the smoke, if we left the window open, the smoke from the trains would come into the room. So I learned something about ethnic and racial prejudice and class prejudice, because it wasn't just that they were Irish and Italian. And remember, I'm speaking about the 20s, and this was a suburb where they were the quote black people of Wakefield.
So this plays a role, and by this time now you're going to Yale, and there's a certain moment when the Yale employees, that is people who work, not the academics, wanted to form a union. And later years, that interesting figure, Bartlett Chometti,
Right.
who became the revered commissioner of baseball because
Right.
he kicked out Pete Rose, turned to be something of a fink.
Well-
I'm sorry to say.
Well, the thing is that
You notice I use terms that Dave Dellinger never used. See, I wish I had. No, the one to before you answer, just make it clear that this guy, a guy socked him once out of fury, and he says, "You feel a little better now." I mean, this guy believes in nonviolence so much that nonviolence of language as well, though at times you have to, but you never use the word think. You know,
No.
I
hated it
but
when
I
in the-
called him that.
I hated it in the 60s when they
Yeah.
called the policemen pigs. Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the bravest things I ever did in my life was when we were on our way to the trial. We stopped at the University of Michigan. I think basketball arena was thousands of people there. And two speakers before me spoke about the pigs, you know. And when I got up, I said, I really don't believe in calling human beings pigs, and explained why. And to my utter surprise, because I expected, it was the most unpopular thing I could say, because every time the word pig had been, they applauded.
You see what you-
Instead, I got a standing ovation, which let me know that inside people there are often ambivalent feelings, and the one that's riding herd at the time rides herd for them, but inside they want something better, which is part of why I don't call people pigs even, because I've known marvelous cops who are my close friends.
See, one of the hallmarks of this book that makes it so good is precisely that. It's several dimensions to it. It's not a book of someone who protests or went to jail and righteously says the other guys are no good or imperial. It's not that at all. You're showing the ambiguity in people. Now, if society can appeal to that other side,
Exactly.
the side that's what you're saying. So how can you alter that society? I know that you admire Dorothy Day very much.
Well, yes,
and
we
there's
were
one
very close
comment
to
she
her.
said, and this is probably the key to Dave Dellinger. Why are you doing what you do? And I once asked her that. A lot of days of her life, like Dave Dellinger. She could have let another. She says, well, I'm looking toward a world in which will be easier, and here's the part of Dellinger, easier for people to behave decently.
Right.
That's it.
A few years ago I was asked to write an introduction for a book by an English sociologist. So naturally I read the book. And there was a phrase in there, which I'll just paraphrase, or a sentence or two. But the idea was that people seem to be, by human nature, what they think they have to be in order to succeed or even survive in a particular type of society. So you have a society which stresses that the object of life is to compete to rise higher than your fellows. More privilege, power, fame, money, whatever it is. And people are caught in that. They think that's the only way they can succeed or whatnot. But inside them, they harbor feelings of not just compassion and love for those who fail, but of, real sisterly, brotherly attitudes.
We have to follow through.
And something
on this.
is needed to.
We have to follow through on this. This is the theme we'll pursue, among other things. We go along, we improvise too. Dave Dellinger's book is a beauty. It's called From Yale to Jail, which is literal, by the way. Yale to jail.
I'm going to end the tour reading in jail, if I'm not arrested between now and then.
Here you are, young. The big American Depression comes along, the Great Depression of the 30s. And now we're talking in terms of 1993 rather than 30s. You see the homeless, you see men, women, kids, you see bread lines. And so here are you.
Well, I think, I quote a phrase of Dickens, it's the worst of times and the best of times. The worst of times, I think, is the kind of thing that you described. Like during the time that the Soviet Union was breaking up, and people said, we won the Cold War. But during that period, we had a tripling of billionaires in this country and a doubling of the homeless. And, it's all very fine to say that all people are created equal in this country. And after all, when the children of the homeless get to be 18, they'll be able to vote. But that doesn't make it a democratic country, or doesn't make people equal. And I think that in a way what's happened is the Soviet Union has proved that you can't have economic democracy, which was the aim of the original revolutionaries, without political democracy and civil liberties. And I think the United States has proved that you can't have political democracy if you don't have economic democracy. And so that's one of the things I always try to concentrate on. People call me, they introduce me and say, peace activist Dave Dellinger. I say, no, justice activist Dave Dellinger, because there can be no peace without justice.
Yeah. But also the aspect of nonviolence is in it throughout,
of course.
too. Of course, you speak of repression of a society, and you can't have a society of equity with means that are repressive. Because you're open to anybody, that no matter how outrageous that opinion might be.
Well, one of my favorite poets, William Blake, says that friendship is debate. Yeah. So I love it, and I often say that, like when I spoke at a high school recently. I try to encourage the kids, to say, you really don't see things the way they are, And finally, I got one guy who finally did challenge me, because the others, some of them had seen the film of the conspiracy trial and so forth. And so they tended to agree with me. But this one guy said, you're all wet, blah, blah, blah. So afterward, and we got together a bit on it, he modified his opinion, and I tried to explain why. Afterwards, the bell rang and he left. So I found out his name and I left him a book. Gave him a book, and I said, thank you for speaking up your own personal opinions, which ran counter to the emphasis that I was making in the class. Thank you, and I hope you continue to do that the rest of your life.
Yeah, this is Dave Dellinger now in the 1990s, dude. But it was inevitable, because the child in this instance is father of the man, or at least the young man is father of the middle-aged man. And so right. There's the depression of the 30s.
Well, I went on the road. There were a series of things, but actually one of the other things, if I could just go back, studs, the same year that I fell in love with a poor Irish girl from across the tracks and so forth, I'd always hated church growing up. And I was a good reader. And I looked up something, I think from another poet, Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who had referred to Jesus, and I looked it up. And all of a sudden, to my utter surprise, I fell in love with the New Testament. And then I read, Jesus refers to the Old Testament. I went back there and I fell in love with some of the prophets. Now, that doesn't mean I loved it, all of it. I was as selective as the minister was. The minister intoned against us, original sin and hellfire and damnation. And what I noticed was God notices even the fall of a sparrow. Or Jesus actually liked to have a good time. He turned the water into wine at the wedding feast. And, the thing about, blessed are the poor, and say good,
there is a theory
pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you and so forth.
There's a theory about Jesus, the Lord of the dance. You heard the Lord, he dancing, and the disciples were dancing.
Yes.
And so there was delight.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's come back to, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You decided to become a bum yourself. Now, this is interesting. You put yourself in the position of an outcast economically. And then you notice an attitude change toward you.
Yes.
That. You found ambivalence here, too?
You see, what happened was that, why I went back to church was, and the New Testament was because I belonged to the college religious Yale Religious Association and Social Action Group, Service Group. And one time, my freshman year, there was a noise outside the window when we were having a meeting. We didn't know what it was. Found out that a quote bum had collapsed and the ambulance had taken him away. When I went home, for some reason, I couldn't sleep. So I went to the campus police, found out the hospital. I went to the hospital, and, they said, well, it was after midnight, come back visiting hours. Was he a relative? Why are you interested? And so finally I got through to a young intern who said he died of malnutrition. So I immediately said, well, was there any sign of alcohol? And he said, no. As a matter of fact, he died of starvation. And so after that, I used to, if I was on my way to the college dining hall and somebody would ask me for money for food, I would say, oh, I'm just going to this cafeteria over here, a block away. Let's go and eat together. So I wouldn't go to the college dining hall. And so that led me to find out some things and to make some good temporary friendships. And so anyway, the time came when I just put on my oldest clothes and I hitchhiked and I stayed at hobo missions, missions and hobo jungles, and I rode the freights. And I met some of the most wonderful people you'd ever find in your life, just like I met in jail people who had done terrible things. You asked me earlier if I was a Quaker. I'm not a Quaker. I'm not officially anything, I guess, most of the time. But I have found that there's a spark of divinity, what the Quakers call a spark of divinity, in every human being, if you're open to it. And if they know you're open to it, you begin to find it. It comes out. Maybe it's been repressed,
so
but
there
it's
you were.
there.
You found among the hobos traveling and others a camaraderie. At the same time, there was also, when I run into kids who are saying, it was every man for himself. You could trust nobody. It was both. It was you found the ambivalence. And so in jail, again, we come to World War II. You were sent to Danbury.
Yes, first time, and then Lewisburg
and now
the
in jail,
second time.
Guards are saying, this guy is getting you guys in trouble. You ought to get him. No, now, you and the prisoners, how did that work? You and your fellow inmates.
Well, the only problem we had was with some of the prisoners when we fought against racial segregation, because the federal prisons were segregated. In fact, in my first Saturday night movie, I walked in with a black man, was talking to him, and they motioned me into the white section, him into the black section, and I just couldn't do it. It wasn't an organized protest. I just knew they had just arrived, but I couldn't do it. So I sat next to him, and the next thing I knew, they turned off the lights for the film, but before they started, I had all these lights in my eyes, and I was taken off to solitary. And when I got out, then the guards had been saying that this guy is a troublemaker, a college kid, who doesn't know what life is like. And if he keeps acting that way and you guys don't take care of him, he's going to cause us to shut down the various privileges, like the Saturday night movie or one thing or another. So, and this was, of course, the first and the mildest of the cases in which federal guards or officials tried to get the prisoners not to beat up not just me, but other people. And in that case, actually a big black man, see, the only place that wasn't segregated, well, after you got in there, was the where the maximum security cell where the people were under punishment, and that they punished both blacks and whites and threw them in together. And he said, if anybody, he said, I told them, and I'll tell you, if anybody lays a finger on you, you just tell them Al Harris will take care of them. And when we got out of prison a year and a day later, as I say, before Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was a long-termer who was spending his last times in this supposedly minimal jail. And so he got out 2 or 3 weeks or maybe a month after we did. He came and lived in our commune and organized he organized something called the Essex County Equality League, which picketed and took action when Newark, New Jersey restaurants wouldn't admit black people to them. So I basically got along with him. Now, it also helped that I was a good athlete. When I was in Lewisburg, I was
then you were in Lewisburg prison.
Yeah, for 2 years. Yeah. And I was just lucky enough not to be in the hole or in solitary confinement, as I was from time to time, for part of the basketball season. And I played on the team, and actually Bucknell College came, and we beat them, the Lewisburg team. So if you've never been in prison, you don't understand how important that vicarious self-fulfillment is. You're taught not to believe in yourself. You're treated like you're less than human. And so if I was a member of a basketball team, that beat Bucknell, that changed everything.
Go ahead.
Plus, also, actually, that one of the gangs there, it just happened that after I got out of the hole one time, I was put in the punishment gang with him. And the first day, the guard started roughing him up, and I stepped out of line and got in between and said, you can't do that, and one thing or another. So that helped. But the time came when that person, actually, the head of one of the two gangs in prison, came to me, and because he didn't understand everything about how I would approach things, it was in the outdoor exercise area of the track, and we were all walking around. He says, "You better get your boys together, Dill, because the captain just offered me parole if I would get my gang and take care of you." And he said, I told him no. And actually, he used an expletive about, I told him to shove it up and so forth. And I knew he hadn't said that or else he'd be in the hole himself. Yeah. But then he says, but Tippy, who was the head of the other gang, Tippy's in there now. They just called his number. And, that's blah, blah, blah. He swore at him. He says, he'll probably do it. But neither one did.
But there's something they sensed in you, but you also them. As you have a friend, man, we owe both of my Howard Zinn,
a
historian who went
Great
to
guy.
Vietnam with you to pick up some POWs. But he has something, he says, hierarchy of values. You were on the baseball team in Lewisburg, and a fellow inmate of yours, ministry student, Don Benedict.
Oh, Don Benedict. That was in Danbury.
In Danbury?
Yeah, well, he was one of the best soft
that
pitchers
story
in the
is
country.
worth recounting. You were in the hole.
Actually, we weren't in the hole. We were in solitary confinement. And I think we were one game ahead, and it was the last game of the season, and it was the team that was in second place. Or maybe we were tied with them, I forget. And he was such a great pitcher, and three of us from the seminary were on the team. And
you were in prison. You were in prison for draft resistance.
Draft resistance, yes. And that when the time came for the game, and we were locked in solitary confinement, supposedly to stay there until we straightened up and changed our whole attitude and agreed to obey all orders, no matter what they were. And then they got afraid of a prison riot, because they might lose the game because we couldn't play, particularly because Don couldn't. The warden went to Don and tried to persuade him to come out, so that would calm things down. And he was the best of us, the most important one as pitcher, and he refused to come unless we were all out. Well, the warden wouldn't do it, supposedly. But then the noon of the game, we all came out and we walked into the dining hall, and that's the biggest ovation I ever got in my life. And we won the game.
It's called hierarchy of value. You're talking about things seemingly unimportant, and it's so terribly important. Okay. So we're talking about Dave Dellinger, from Yale to jail. Dave Dellinger. So this is young Dave Dellinger, now 30s, 40s, fasting. Now, so many times, the last time I met you, you had just finished a fast, and you first started the fast way, way back. How many times you engaged in fasts?
I'm not sure, but the interesting thing, Studs, is that I don't think of myself as a faster particularly. But when I was in prison, and there were abominable conditions, and it looked like we might be able to do something about them, we went on a number of what I called hunger strikes. And, the longest one I write about in the book, 65 days, where we won some concessions, some significant concessions. Well, the last 32 I was tube-fed, force-fed with a tube down my nose, pouring liquid and so forth. But I had never fasted outside. But then...
hunger strike is what I meant.
Yeah, hunger strike there, and there were a number of them. Yeah. But when I got outside... It's possible that the first time I fasted, because I got out in 1945, was during the Korean War, when a group of us, in the intentional community I was in, we fasted. But again, it was a protest. And automatically, I think, when you fast, there is some kind of spiritual deepening that takes place. But I never have fasted for, quote, self-purification, But I have gone on hunger strikes or fasts for
hunger
some
strikes.
objective.
All right,
But I
now-
have found that they also are very spiritually rewarding.
Now I want to ask about a hunger strike.
Yeah.
Through the decades, through the centuries, perhaps, hunger strikes. One remember the governor of Cork, the mayor of Cork during
Yes, well, the
Revolution.
Irish.
Terence McSwiney died in prison hunger.
Bobby
Now,
Sands.
What is the now? What? Explain the hunger strike with political.
Well, I
significance.
think that the
And is it
purpose is
effective?
to alert and stimulate people to face up to the injustice of what is going on. And the recent fast that you referred to, I fasted along with a number of other people, at least 11 of us, from September 1st, 92 to October 12th, Columbus Day. And it was seizing upon that time. And some of the fasters would talk more about Columbus. I did some, but I talked more about the Los Angeles riots and the doubling of the homeless that I referred to and that kind of thing. And the media mostly stayed away from it, although I had an article about it in the Los Angeles Times, which I've included in the appendix of this book. But on the other hand, everywhere I went, and I had a lot of speaking engagements during it, so while fasting, I would go out from Washington where this was centered, and somehow or other, the fact people look at you, and in our kind of instant gratification society, they say, gee, if this guy is going to go 42 days without eating, maybe it's something I should at least pay attention to or think about, and then particularly like when my wife and I jointly led or participated in a retreat for 4 days during that period, then there was a chance really to do it. So I think it does, it does tell people, hey, this is something it calls attention to whatever the problem is you're fasting about.
And so we come to, you mentioned the phrase intentional community. Now you're out of jail a number of times, you're getting now older, the family. A cooperative, describe that and what happened.
Well,
when you were known also as protesting
yes.
causes that were popular.
Oh, when you say what happened. Well, actually, we had this, what we called intentional community. It went through various phases. But originally it was a cooperative in which we all put in whatever we could afford or could raise to buy 20 acres of land. But we had, contrary to the house that we'd been living in before some of us went to jail, before I went to jail, and most of the people in it, but this new group, well, that house was more like a Catholic worker house, and we were all jammed into a house, and anybody who came for food, to fellowship, clothing, whatever, was brought in. But that got to be draining to people. I mean, we were there, let's say you're there 2 years. After a while, you haven't had enough privacy, enough solitude, so forth. And also, by the time of the second community, I now had 2 children. One of them, my son, was 14 months old when I got out of Lewisburg. He was born while I was there. And so we had separate living quarters, and we would share certain common meals and a lot of common activities like building, our 2-room house to adding a room, that kind of thing. And we tried to support ourselves by having a printing and publishing business. I learned the printing trade, 6 months of apprenticeship, and then I resigned and so forth. And we called it Libertarian Press, a Workers' Cooperative, which meant that we didn't have bosses and workers or brain people and dirty workers, but everybody took their turn washing the press or unloading the paper or working on an article or whatever. But in late 1967, when I was chairman of the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, and there was a lot of publicity about it, somebody destroyed all of the printing equipment, scattered the papers or took files and so forth, and left a death threat with red ink, next time it will be you. And immediately, the head of the Veterans of Foreign Wars of that town and 2 others came up to see me the minute it was known and said, Dill, nobody local would have done this. we don't always agree with your ideas, but we're friends, and nobody would do this. And I fully believe it. And it is my belief that the government instigated it or used somebody
later
to do it.
an actual bomb came in the form of scotch.
Then I received a bomb. It was as a Christmas present. It was and I got suspicious because the address was the address of the Peace Committee, the Anti-Vietnam War Committee in New York, that I was co-chair of, a co-coordinator of, and that address, but it said VC for Viet Cong, and I thought, who was doing that joke and so forth. Yeah. I got just suspicious enough so that after a while, I took the brown paper off, and it was a bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label Scotch, but I was suspicious. And my son kept saying, look at the old man savoring his scotch before he drinks it. Open it up, Dad, and you and I'll have a sip. So I had to do something, so I pulled apart down at the bottom, the little bit, and I saw black powder and wires.
Wow.
Well, and I had my whole family there, and my first grandchild was there, and there was a hand grenade, a bottle of gasoline, which I was, to destroy the evidence to start a fire. Well, when the bomb squad came, also somebody from the post office came, and he said, this is no fly-by-night outfit. This is a very sophisticated outfit, and this is the same kind of bomb that has blown up twice in our post office. And I had read about those, but it never occurred to me. And even up till that moment, it never occurred to me they'd been sent to me. But he said, this is the same kind, and we're the sorting center for your mail. So this is the third bomb that has been sent to you. So then he said, we're going to get those guys because two of our people were maimed for life, will never recover from the bombs that exploded in our... But I never heard a word from him or anybody else again, and I believe it went too high up in official quarters to conduct it. And I never followed up on it much either. I was too busy doing other things.
But it's interesting that the veterans of foreign wars also want to protect you, just as earlier, you see, you found other guys. And there's one guy, you were talking against the Vietnam War, and a man is furious at you, and he's shouting invective at you, and then
I'm trying to think which one.
You didn't realize you lost a son in Vietnam, and it's gone crazy.
No, it was in Korea.
In Korea.
Korean War.
And you said to him, "If it makes you feel better, hit me." And he leveled you, he decked you, and knocked you out.
Not much common sense did I have? The fact is.
But then what happened? Then he saw it.
Well, actually, when of course, I didn't know. I was up in the stepladder talking. It was in Times Square. And I was worried because there were some people there of this group that I didn't know. And he'd been hitting people, this man. And then I was afraid they were getting rough with him. So, anyway, so I finally said, if let him go, and I tried to talk to him. And then I said, I'll come down. If it makes you feel any better, you can hit me. And I ducked a couple times first. Then I realized I wasn't living up to my word, so I put my arms down. When I woke up, I was unconscious. But he had been kicking me after I was down. And I got a broken jaw and an eye injury that I've never recovered from. But a woman had thrown herself on top of me and said, if you have to kick somebody, kick me. And that got to him.
But then the guy later on, you walked away.
Later on, he apologized.
Just as you did when you were a young kid. Yeah. There was a town toughie. There was a Yale game, and this kid thought you were one of the rough guys there, and he socked you, and you leveled him.
Well, he blindsided me.
But then you leveled him.
I did.
And then you took him home, and he became your friend.
That's right.
So this is the way you...
Well, it's the way human beings often do.
But you understand the human heart, don't you?
But I hope so.
This is what it's about.
I keep learning more about it all the time.
I know we're not going to get to the end of the book. We're talking to Dave Dellinger. Naturally, listeners know him best as the oldest of the 8 conspirators in the conspiracy trial in Chicago and in the court of Judge Hoffman, which had aspects of great burlesque to it as well.
Yes.
But we come to something interesting we have to get in. it was a time, the 60s, when the young kids were coming up who were born after World War II, and the old scrappers, and they had differences, more traditional. Sane was traditional, and the young kids were coming in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam movement wanted more outward displays.
Right.
And there was a battle here. And you were of both schools, but you recognized the changes, didn't you?
Well, I learned then, which I'd also learned as a youngster, when the 20 of us decided that we wouldn't register for the draft, we were deluged with older people who had inspired us mostly, their history and their anti-war things I'd learned a lot from. But they said, oh, if you do that, it'll be a disgrace to the movement. You must. And so,
Reinhold Niebuhr was one of them, wasn't he?
Reinhold Niebuhr was one who had inspired me a lot.
He was your teacher, in a sense.
And he was one, yes. But he had changed his viewpoint by then. And he said that, the day we went to jail, he spoke in chapel against us, against what we'd done.
And
anyway,
so you saw that happen.
Then I learned it also as an older person, that those kids came along and they knew things and saw things that I didn't. Now, it's not one-sided. I had some things to teach or to at least to communicate with them and for them to listen to, but they had just as much to teach or to communicate to me and to listen to. So I got in trouble again with some of the older peace leaders by backing, the early SDS, when it called the first national demonstration against the war in Vietnam. There were 22, I think it was, major peace leaders, belonging to, I have to use the word bureaucracies in a sense, because they were running organizations and had funds to worry about and everything. And
some were old friends of yours.
Yes, of course, associates. And but they condemned this thing because it had not criticized Hanoi and Peking equally with Washington. To me, we were the richest, most powerful country in the world. It had gone halfway across the globe to impose its will on the Vietnamese people and to try to really to gain a foothold there economically and politically. And I wasn't about to say, well, you're resisting with violence, therefore I'm going to wash my hands off it. I supported that demonstration. And most of those older leaders that I'm talking about, or my age leaders, came around after a while, but it took a while. They were a little slower.
Look, there's one story you told you. Bayard Rustin, who was very active and very much the rebel in the very beginning, quite changed a great deal.
One of the most creative practitioners of nonviolence I ever knew.
And you met him years later, and you met him at a party years later, and he said, "You stuck to your principles and I didn't," and he started crying.
That's right. And I loved Bayard, and I understood why, although, I wasn't in favor of the things he did. But he was a very flamboyant homosexual at a time when prejudice and homophobia raised things. And amongst others, Martin Luther King had fired him from his staff because, well, I'll say it, because Adam Clayton Powell was jealous of Martin Luther King and knew that Bayard, at that point, had more experience and more imagination and creativity than the very eloquent and growing Martin Luther King, who gradually, kept moving on till he got so dangerous they had to kill him. But anyway, so Powell said, if you don't get rid of Rustin, I will expose you for having a homosexual on your staff, and the implication was for being allied to him, having that, quote, taint himself. And that was only one of several instances I tell about in the book where it broke Bayard's heart.
Yeah, of course, your book also deals with King coming out against the Vietnam War and what happened, the pressures, and how he himself had to be pressured from below. And Dave Dellinger, from Yale to jail, Pantheon. So in the time remaining, Dave, your autobiography, your memoir, throughout there is this, I find this spine to the book, that you are, in some of the blurbs, there's one by Noam Chomsky, whom we both admire very much.
Right.
And there's one by Grace Paley, who writes short stories, and I do one. And I made the comment The oldest of the Conspiracy 8 turns out to be the most obstinate. This book tells us why. It's about an American we read about often but seldom run into, who speaks truth to power. And so we come to the last part of the book, the work you going to Vietnam and met some of the quote-unquote enemy there, and the attacks on King for coming out against the war in the early days, and the Chicago trial, of course, that has its own memories. A thought about that before I come back to the key to the book again, beginnings in you and your old man. But the trial.
Well, the interesting thing about the trial is that it's now thought that we came here only to protest the Vietnam War, but actually the mobilization had organized a series of workshops, centers in different buildings where women's issues, prison issues, Native American issues, education, all these things in other words, we were going to draw up an alternate platform to that of the Democratic Party. But because of the threats from Mayor Daley, and after Martin Luther King was assassinated and the black riots took place, the police apparently were more restrained than they sometimes are, and Daley bawled them out and said, next time, shoot to kill someone committing a felony and shoot to maim somebody committing a misdemeanor. And that and other things were used to basically cut down our numbers. But also, although a lot of those workshops met, after the first day when the Yippies, A.B. Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Paul Krasner, and others, had wanted to have permit to be in Lincoln Park. There was a deadline set. I forget what time it was. And when we all went out of the city, actually the mayor's person in charge of youth, the youth commissioner, and I don't know the title. Anyway, I'd met him in our trying to negotiate things. As I was walking out of the park, we were following the deadline that time. He all of a sudden, out of the crowd, somebody pulled on my right sleeve, and I looked around, and it was this guy from the youth group, and he said, when you get out of here, watch out, just stay close to the park, down to the left, get away as quick as you can, because the police are going to attack. And they did. They came in, shouting their, I don't know if that time they did, but they had this famous goose step and kill, 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 And so after that, some of us felt that rather than spend time on those workshops, we should be out there in case other demonstrators, would get so upset and angry that they would provoke the police. And so we tried to be there to keep it as nonviolent as possible.
This is all in the book, but I have to end before we hear Amazing Grace, which is right.
Oh, wonderful.
Before that, I come back to your father. Toward the very end, and your father was dying, you visited him, and he said he was proud of you.
Yes, he had come through the years. He thought I was, quote, throwing my life away when I went to jail as I did. He had transferred a lot of his ambitions to me at that point. But step by step, particularly when we had children, because one of the arguments was you've got to, be more conservative and act the way the society does, because how, to show your children. And he used to visit us in the intentional community and say, my God, your children are growing up so wonderfully, So he'd begun to change, but at the end, he said that you lived your life the way I think was right, and I wish I'd been able to live my life a little more that way. And then I started to talk about the waitresses, how our eyes, when he defended the waitresses, our eyes had met and something important had happened inside me. And he said, yes, yes. In fact, I said to him, you are responsible, Dad, for this. And he said, and when I mentioned the waitress, he said, yes, yes, I know. And we didn't even have to go into it, because he remembered and I remembered, and that was a bond between us through all those years.
From Yale to jail. The life story of a moral dissenter, Dave Dellinger, Pantheon, the publishers, and it's a pip. Thank you very much.
And you're a pip, Studs, so I'm happy to be here with you.